Well, first of all, on behalf of the Ruskin Art Club, which is celebrating its 130th anniversary this year, one of the oldest Ruskinian organizations in the world, actually, dating back to the time when Ruskin was still alive, when John Ruskin, the great art and social critic, was still with us. Back in L.A. in 1888, when things were still the Wild West out here. So, on behalf of the Ruskin Art Club, and especially thanking the Focolari and the Women's Household, and Maria in particular, for graciously hosting us for this Ruskin Circle discussion. We do these, it depends, 3 or 4 times, sometimes more, a year. We call it the Ruskin Circle. The idea is to gather together in a home, usually in some informal session, to talk about some topic of current interest, and usually to take a Ruskin text as a kind of starter for that discussion. For example, we did a Ruskin Circle on first principles of ecology a few months ago. So it's always some issue that we're all grappling with, and to use the great vision of John Ruskin to kind of open up the topic and get us to refresh our thinking about these areas. So tonight is, as you saw from the various flyers, the subject is the ethics of profit. This is part of a major part of Ruskin's shift in his thinking from art criticism in the earlier part of his career to in mid-career shifting to social and economic criticism. For Ruskin, art and life were fundamentally linked, and he saw all these implications in his art criticism building towards even a broader view of the world in his social and economic criticism. So we brought with us a member of the Ruskin Art Club and a distinguished member of the Guild of St. George, the American branch of it, Professor Jim Spates from Hobart and William Smith Colleges, a emeritus sociology professor and Ruskin scholar, to take us through probably the key, what some would even say would be Ruskin's key work, but certainly the key work in his economic and social thinking. The 4 essays he wrote in the book that what later on came out as a book called Unto This Last. The part of the inspiration of this for me came from an article actually in Sojourners magazine I think it was a year ago I read, called The Gospel of Enough. And it was about Christian business people thinking about the whole notion of profit and what profit is to go for, and people who were reinvesting that profit in their workers and in a more humanist approach to business. Jim also has a wonderful blog, Why Ruskin, which is on our website as well. And what was it, last year, I think, you published the Fairbanks pieces.
Oh yeah, it would have been last year.
Yeah, Jim wrote a kind of novelistic treatment of a discussion between Ruskin and an American businessman.
No, British
businessman on a vacation in the Alps, and that too caused me to think that this might be a particularly useful discussion. So, without further ado, Professor James Spates.
Thank you, Gabe. It's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful to see you all, and thank you for having me to a brand new part of LA. Lovely home here, and so on. So I hope that in the next few minutes, what I'm going to try to do is a couple of things. I really want to, I guess I'm going to ask you a question first. How many of you know very much about Ruskin? Okay. How many of you did your homework for today? Okay, a couple did. Good. That's great. All right, and so what Gabriel did very kindly, I'm going to be referring to this last many times in this talk. This is an off-print of the first two essays of Unto This Last, which was 4 essays. We're really going to talk about only the first 2 tonight. And I'll be reading a couple of quotes from this along the way. So if you have a copy, I'll try to point you to it. So let me give you just a little bit of background about Ruskin. He was born in 1819 in London to a very successful sherry merchant. His father's name was John James Ruskin, and he made a fortune, not the biggest of fortunes, but a very comfortable fortune by the selling of sherry to pretty much the English elite. And so John Ruskin, his son, they only had one child. He grew up and not only as the only child, but as who never wanted for anything. He didn't have to. They educated him to the 9th degree. They sent him to Oxford as a gentleman commoner when he wanted to go to the Alps to look at where Turner had painted this wonderful painting, and that wonderful painting they took him. He was a very privileged young man, and he fell in love in those very early years with art, and particularly with Turner. He became a Turner aficionado, and wrote about Turner in the first of. He had 5 volumes of a book that came out over the course of about 17 years called Modern Painters. And the premise of Modern Painters was to show that Turner was the greatest painter who ever lived. Not just the greatest painter of the time, but greater than anybody in the Renaissance and all the people we go back and tout and think is wonderful. And many of the parts of Modern Painters is dedicated to taking a Turner painting and showing you, he did the best he could with reproductions in his age, and walking you through the Turner painting and then comparing it to a painting of Claude's or a painting of Rembrandt's or a painting of someone else's, and to show you how if you really looked at it properly, you would see that Turner did it better. And so that's another argument. That's not for tonight. But the short of the story was it made Turner much more famous. He was already famous, but it made him much more famous. Drove his market up a lot, as you might imagine. But made Ruskin famous into the bargain, because Ruskin became famous not only for a novel argument, but he became famous for this astonishing prose that he was capable of writing that made you feel the truth of the argument just from reading the wonderful words and thinking about it, letting the images grow in your mind as you went along. So he wrote this he really took England by storm. They had never read stuff like this before. And here's a sidebar, but an important one. Ruskin in his time was as famous as anybody you know from 19th century England. He was as famous as Tennyson. He was as famous as Dickens. He was as famous as Gladstone and Disraeli. He was as famous as Thomas Hardy. All of those people, all the pre-Raphaelite painters, because he was so convincing in what he did and so wonderfully evocative in people's minds. So he writes the first volume of Modern Painters in 1843, decides he wants to go back and study them more carefully, goes back and then takes another couple of years to do it, writes a second volume called Modern Painters 2, where he brings in depth and rediscovers. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine today, but rediscovers people like Tintoretto and Veronese and Giorgione. All these great Italian painters of the Renaissance, which in Ruskin's day had been essentially forgotten. And he tells you how wonderful these folks were too, along with Turner. And so he writes a second volume and gets to be more famous. Then he goes and says, along the way, he begins to get interested in architecture. And he looks at these great buildings. So many of you, I hope, have been, and if you haven't, you're going to put it on your list to go. All these wonderful buildings in France and Italy, these great cathedrals, and he becomes mesmerized by it. And he said, how did they do this? How did they make these wonderful buildings? So he writes a third book called The 7 Lamps of Architecture. And the burden of the 7 Lamps of Architecture is to show you the 7 principles which, if they are in a building, elevate it from the mundane to the interesting to the transcendent. And he writes a chapter on each of these, what he calls them lamps, because they light the way to great architecture. Makes him even more famous. So he's doing all of this, and he wants to now. But now he's beginning to get worried about what he's seeing, not from the Middle Ages, because he thinks the Middle Ages was this wonderful period of building things together and making architecture that lasts forever. But he begins to get worried because he's looking around him at the same time, and he sees the beginning of the disintegration of European society. He sees the Industrial Revolution on the march in its very roughshod boots. I mean, the job of the Industrial Revolution is essentially to get everybody rich, and not to preserve the environment or take care of the great buildings or all the things that Ruskin had come to cherish. And so he begins to be worried about all of this, and he has loved Venice since the first time he was there. And so he goes back to Venice in the early 1850s and writes a mammoth, wonderful book, still wonderful to read, I guarantee it. If you want to spend an afternoon or 2,700 of them reading the Stones of Venice, because it's like 1,500 pages long, please do so. The argument is that he wants to show why Venice thrived as it did for so long and then fell apart. It thrived because for about a couple of hundred years it lived in tune with the great principles of its own religion. It lived by the principles of Christianity as they practiced them in those days. They were honest in their dealings, they took care of their neighbors, they tried to help their poor, and so on. And then, along bit by bit, all of that knowledge begins to be lost, and the whole culture of Venice begins to be corrupted. And as it begins to be corrupted, it becomes egotistical rather than collective, and it becomes money-oriented as opposed to being community-oriented, and Venice falls. It's all there to be seen in the Stones of Venice, which is the title of his books, his 3-volume set. So he then means this as a warning to England, because he sees this happening in England at the same time, and he wants to save England. He doesn't want England to go down the same path that Venice went down, and that's the purport of that book. And so people always love Ruskin's words. I mean, all the people, the literati read him, all the educated people read him. They loved his words. They were so beautiful. And as the 1850s go on, he says to himself, but they're not paying any attention to the message. What I want them to do is learn to love nature. What I want them to do is to figure out why it is so important to take care of each other and to love each other and support each other. But they just think the words are fabulous. And the words are fabulous. And he begins to think, well, I'm missing everything that I intended them to do, so what if they like the words? And so that is what it propels him to think through, that he has to do something to change this. They're not paying any attention to what he really wants them to hear. So he's now going to write something about the problems of the social order in which they all exist. And that brings him to unto this last. And this argument about, it's really the first attempt, it's really an attack on laissez-faire capitalism and the greed and that it underlies laissez-faire capitalism. What he wants to do is to get them to think about the way a good social order would operate. So I'll come to that in a moment. But I thought what I would do as we approach that is that I want to read you a couple of these passages that people love so much. So it's on the handout right here. Everybody got one? Yes. Excellent. So I wanted to share. Do you have one, Gabe? Yeah. I wanted to share these two with you. Actually, I want to share 3 with you. But I want to show you what a wonderful writer he was. And I want to show you why people were just so taken with what he was writing and how he was writing it. And I want to show you at the same time how they were missing the message. All right, so these the first 2 really come from the 7 Lamps of Architecture. Wonderful book, much shorter than the Stones of Venice. Won't take you as many afternoons. Ruskin writes, God has lent us the earth for our life. It is a great entail. It belongs as much to those who are to come after us and whose names are already written in the book of creation as it does to us. And we have no right by anything that we do or neglect to involve them in unnecessary penalties or deprive them of benefits which it was in our power to bequeath. Every human action gains in honor and grace, in all true magnificence by its regard for the things that are to come. It's a just beautiful passage. I mean, an argument can be made, some have made it, I certainly would support that, is that Ruskin is really the first environmentalist. He loves nature. He sees the beauties of nature. He sees how delicate and sweet and fecund nature is. And he wants everybody to see it as well, so they will love it like he loves it, and they will go and enjoy it, and then they will take the next step, the most important step, which is that we cannot destroy this. This is the gift of God to us, or the gift of the universe to us. And we cannot destroy this. We do this at our peril and out of our ignorance. So many of the books could be summed up with just that in mind. So I wanted to give you one nature passage. There are many. I find them transfixing. Many of them I have read dozens of times. Many of them I have read on the spot because I wanted to, like Ruskin wanted to go see where Turner painted something. I wanted to go where Ruskin wrote something or saw something. So I've done that with a lot of these. And I wanted to give you a sense of, again, the beauty of it. So the words are the important thing, what he's trying to get you to see. Charlotte Bronte, you've all heard Charlotte Bronte, read Ruskin's Modern Painters, and she said, Ruskin taught me to see. Before I read Ruskin's Modern Painters, she said, I had no idea how to approach art. I had no idea what to look for. But Ruskin taught me how to look at a painting and enjoy it and understand it and learn its lessons. It's a lovely reaction, and she was very common among many. Anyway, so this is also from the Seven Lamps of Architecture, and he's now, if you've been to France and you're passing Paris and you're on your way to Switzerland, you go up through the Jura Mountains. They're lower mountains, they're sort of pre-Alps, and they're on one side, the northern side of Lake Geneva, the Jura, J-U-R-A. And it's a whole chain. It's much lower than the Alps themselves, but it's on one side of the Lake of Geneva. Then there's Lake of Geneva, and behind Geneva to the south are the immense Alps, Chamonix and the Matterhorn and all these. And he absolutely adored all of those. So in this passage, it's springtime, and he's going up to the Jura Mountains on his way to Geneva and then on to the main Alps. And so this is how he describes it. No frost-plowed, dust-encumbered paths of ancient glacier fret the soft Jura pastures. No splintered heaps of ruin break the fair ranks of her forest. No pale, defiled, or furious rivers send their rude and changeful ways among her rocks. Patiently, eddy by eddy, the clear green streams wind along their well-known beds. And under the dark quietness of the undisturbed pines, there spring up year by year such company of joyful flowers as I know not the like of among all the blessings of the earth. Isn't this wonderful? It was springtime, too, and all were coming forth in clusters crowded for very love. There was room enough for all, but they crushed their leaves into all manner of strange shapes, only to be nearer each other. There was the wood anemone, star after star, closing every now and then into nebulae, and there was the oxalis, troop by troop, like virginal processions of the Mois de Marie, the dark vertical clefts in the limestone choked up with them as with heavy snow, and touched with ivy on the edges, ivy as light and lovely as the vine. And ever and anon a blue gush of violets and cowslip bells in sunny places, and in the more open ground the vetch and the comfrey and the mezeron and the small sapphire buds of the polygala alpina and the wild strawberry, just a blossom or two, all showered amidst the golden softness of deep, warm, amber-colored moss. Now, isn't that wonderful? And every word of it is true. If you go out in springtime, in the mountains, and take this with you, and look, every word of it is true. And that's one of the great wonders of Ruskin. People say, oh no, he's just, he's a fabulous wordsmith. He is a fabulous wordsmith. But at the same time, he's telling you exactly what he saw. He's telling you how beautiful nature is. And he's telling you, I want you to see this because this is your heritage. This is your gift. You can go and see this too and delight in your day just by going to look at those flowers in the springtime. And that's what made him so furious, because he saw that what was going on in his civilization was this utter insensitivity to nature. If we can use it, we'll use it. If we can get an ore out, we don't care whether we destroy the mountain, the ravine, the river, or anything like that. We'll take whatever we can so we can make money, we can get rich. And it made him furious that they were doing. They were doing the same thing to the great buildings as well. The buildings were starting to break down. They didn't care. They rebuilt them or they tore them down. So all the things that he said are just the most wonderful things in the world, as he saw as the most wonderful things in the world, we're all being disparaged. We're all being just not cared for. And that's what turns him to writing unto this last. Let me share one more passage at the bottom of your page with you to show you how angry it made him. This comes from later in his career. But the later part is not very important. This comes from 1884. But what is important is his perspective on this. So in 1884, he gives 2 lectures in London. He always had to give his lectures at least 2 and 3 times because he was such a good speaker and so many people came out to hear him. Anyway, he gives a lecture called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. So you see the metaphor. The idea is that the whole century is a storm cloud. And you have to imagine, you've probably seen pictures of this, Manchester in the middle of the 19th century, or Birmingham, or London, or any of the other great England. And they're just enshrouded by the gases and the pollution that has been created by this industrial revolution. And he called it the plague cloud. And he said the plague cloud is devouring the earth. And so the idea, again, of the lecture, the storm cloud of the 19th century. Yeah? So here's his passage near the end of that, where you can feel his fury at what's going on. Blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. If in conclusion you ask me for any conceivable cause or meaning of these things, I can tell you none according to your modern beliefs. But I can tell you what meaning it would have borne to the men of old time. Remember that for the last 20 years, England and all foreign nations, either tempting her or following her, have blasphemed the name of God deliberately and openly, and have done iniquity by proclamation, every man doing as much injustice to his brother as it is in his power to do. Of states of such moral gloom, every seer of old predicted the physical gloom, saying, the light shall be darkened in the heavens thereof, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. All Greek, all Christian, all Jewish prophecy insists on the same truth through 1,000 myths. And so, I leave you to compare at leisure the physical result of your own wars and prophecies, and leave you to consider a newly risen truth, that the empire of England, on which formerly the sun never set, has become the one on which he never rises. It's a wonderful passage, but so it gives you a sense of what turned him into writing sociology. I was a sociologist. How I got to Ruskin was through sociology. I had a friend, an English professor friend, and she loved Ruskin, and we taught a course called London in the 19th Century, and she made me read Ruskin the first time, and it was like a window it opened. Like for the first time, I found the sociologist I wanted, because then I got everything he'd ever written on. I stayed in London going on with little stories here, but I stayed in London for 6 months teaching students. Had a wonderful time, and I used to go down there on. If you know London at all, there's a place in central part of London near Piccadilly called Cecil Court, and it's a very short street. But Cecil Court used to have like 12 used bookstores, or as they would call them in England, antiquarian bookstores. And I used to go to every one of them, and I'd come home with these green volumes of Ruskin, which I'd gotten for £2 each. And I would sit and read them So for me, it was like this revelation that I finally found somebody who was telling me the truth, telling it beautifully, and giving me some kind of direction of how to think about what kind of society we should live in a way that was different from my field generally. So he decides, I'm not going to write about art anymore. I'm not going to write about architecture anymore. I'm going to continue to love the flowers. I'm going to continue to love Turner. But I'm going to write about what kind of society we should create for ourselves. And so Unto This Last is his clarion call to his own civilization. And what he wants to do in Unto This Last is that he says, I have two purposes in mind in writing these essays. There's a preface that goes before the passages that you have tonight. There's a preface where he says, there's only two things I want to communicate to you in these essays. The first is that we need a logical definition of wealth. And he goes after, very early on in his first essay, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, he goes after what he calls the political economists of his time. Today we would probably call them the theorists of classical economics. Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, Jeremy Bentham. Those folks that at the time were very, very popular, and everybody was reading their works. And they were making the argument for laissez-faire capitalism. They were basically making the argument that if people go out and follow the rules of making money, everybody can get rich if they work hard and they're smart at it, and whatever they want to do, and so on. And Ruskin was a complete opposition to this idea. He said this is the purpose of business. I'll get to this in different ways. But he says the purpose of business is not to make money. The purpose of business is to care for your customers. This was a radical idea then, and I think still for many now, that people don't think of it like that. So the first thing he says he wants to get across is what he calls a new definition of wealth. No, a definition of wealth. Because he goes through all the texts he read, Mill, he read Ricardo, he read all those people. He goes through, and none of them define wealth. And he said, well, what is wealth? And they all say, well, we don't need to define it because everybody knows what it is. He says, no, you have to know exactly what wealth is. And so at the very end of Unto This Last, he gives his definition of wealth. It's 6 words long. We won't get to it tonight, but I'll tell you them now because you'll get it. Because he says, there is no wealth but life. That's the definition of wealth. So he wants to create a definition of wealth that he will then use as the framework for what he wants to communicate to them. And the second purpose of Unto This Last is to convince his readers that there's only one way to accumulate true wealth. And the way in which you do this is through honest dealing with each other in trade. He says, if I can convince you only of this one thing, that people must be honest with one another when they trade, then I will have been successful in what I want to communicate to you. You create something, you charge a fair price for it. You are honest with the people that you trade with about what you are delivering, when you will deliver it, and why it costs as much as it does. You are honest with each other about what your expectations are. No trickery, no cheating, no adulterating of food, no putting of some other substance in the milk or some other alloy in the ore that you think you're buying. Because all of that is dishonest, and all of that exploits somebody. And so those are the two things that he wants to communicate. He says, these are laws. I am not making this up. This is the law of trade. This is the law of trade for all time. It was the law 1,000 years ago. It'll be the law 1,000 years from now. You can abrogate the law. You can deny it. You can pretend it doesn't exist. You can do all the things that whatever you wish to pretend it doesn't pertain to you, it always pertains to you. Treat someone well in business, and almost always, can't promise, it will redound to your favor. Treat someone ill in business, and almost always, can't promise, it will redound to your punishment. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will. because this is the law of honest exchange between human beings. Okay. He says, it's not my law. It's the Bible's law. It's the Hebrew law. It's Hillel's law. It's Buddha's law. It's Dante's law. It's Cicero's law. It's the law of all the greatest thinkers of history. But the purpose of doing business is to help each other get better. Ruskin's essays first began to appear in a magazine, an intellectual magazine, sort of like The Atlantic, or no, not The Atlantic anymore, Harper's, and The New Yorker, in a magazine like that in London called the Cornhill Magazine in 1860, and he contracted with the editor of the magazine, who was named William Makepeace Thackeray, who was a very famous novelist in his own right during that period. And contract's not the right word. He agreed that he would write 7 essays on political economy. In the end, he only wrote 4 because people were so angry at what he was writing. They put so much pressure on Thackeray and the people who were publishing the Unto This Last essays that they shut him down and they wouldn't let him publish anymore. Okay, so that's one bit of the framework. Now I want to just talk to you, and then we'll get to the essays themselves. So I want to explain to you one more thing, and many of you are probably bringing coals to Newcastle, as they would say in England, for some of you. But I want to talk a little bit about the metaphor that he uses for the book. It's called Unto This Last. And Unto This Last comes from a very specific parable of Christ in the New Testament, in Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 14. And it's called the parable, it's very famous as the parable of the vineyard worker. And it goes like this. This is the metaphor for the whole book. There was once a vineyard owner, owned a whole bunch of vineyards. It's October, or better said, September. It's September and it's time for the harvest. He doesn't have enough workers to go out and do the work for him, so he goes to the town and hires the number early in the morning, sunrise, let's say, or not too long after, and hires enough workers that he thinks will be able to do the work for him. He brings them back, he sets them to work, he makes an agreement with them. And the agreement is that he will pay them a penny a day. Well, maybe it would be $100 a day now, I don't know. But a decent, whatever the decent wage going was at the time. And they all agree and they come and they set to work. Around noontime, he thinks, I need some more workers. So he goes into town again, and around the marketplace, there's more workers. And he says to them, come, why don't you 10 or 12 come with me, and I'll put you to work in the vineyard. And they all agree, and he agrees with them too. And they come and they get set to work. And then about 5 o'clock, he's in town just doing an errand. And he comes to the marketplace and he sees 5 or 6 people in the market, men in the market who have not been hired. He said, well, why aren't you going to work? And he said, well, no one's come to hire us. He said, well, I'll hire you. So they climb onto his cart or whatever he's got, and he takes them back and he sets them to work about 5:30. At 8 o'clock, it's getting too dark. And so he calls them all in. He's going to pay them for the day. And he brings in the ones who came in last first. And he pays them a penny a day. And then come the ones that he hired at noontime. And they come up and he pays them a penny a day. And now there's grumbling in the ranks behind. And then finally come the ones he hired in the morning at 7:30. And they've worked all day. And he pays them a penny a day. And they're very angry at him, because they think they work longer, and so they should be paid more. He says, no, I pay unto this last as I pay unto thee, because what I pay you is fair for you to live a decent life today and be ready to come to work tomorrow. So I have it. I'm going to read it to you. At the very end, he gives you the exact words. Here are the words from Matthew. He says to one of these complaining workers, he says, friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst thou not agree with me for a penny? Take that thine is, and go thy way. I will give unto this last as unto thee. Is it not lawful for me to do with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? Because the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. So Ruskin uses the passage of the vineyard owner because he wants to communicate that the wisdom of the vineyard owner is to treat everybody who works for him as a real living, breathing human being. And he knows that they need a penny a day in order to survive. They got to buy food for their family, they got to pay their rent, they got to get good shoes, they got to be strong enough for the next morning to be picked up at the market and work again. Assume that he pays some of them half a penny a day. What happens to them? They can't pay their rent. They can't get enough food. If they show up at work tomorrow, they're going to get tired in the middle of the day. They're not going to do a good job. You pay them what they need as human beings in order to survive. That is your obligation as the employer. The employer is always responsible for those he or she employs. You do for them what they need as human beings, and they give to you what you ask of them as human beings. It's a critical idea and very radical in Ruskin's day, because and probably in our day as well, because we're constantly trying to cut corners here and so on. And he says, and lastly, to those of you who complain, I pay them a penny a day because it is right. Because it is morally right. They are human beings, and they have to have that. And so that's what he did. He went in at the very end. He saw 5 or 7 people still not working. He said, okay, they need their penny a day. I have a penny. But look at what he does. He lessens his own pocket for the good of others. He could have kept that money. He didn't have to hire those men at the end. He could have paid, and they would have taken it because they weren't getting enough work. He could have paid them half a penny. He could have paid them a quarter of a penny, and they would have been happy to take it. Or maybe not happy, but they would have taken it because they were desperate for the work. So by paying them what they absolutely need in order to live, he supports them all. He gives them the things that they need in return for which they feel that they have been treated fairly and justly by him. That's the metaphor of unto this last. In Ruskin's day, everybody in his audience would have been 98% Christian. 99% probably, would have heard this parable many times and wouldn't have really understood it in the way that he intended it. Okay, enough by way of introduction. Let's talk about these essays for a few moments now. The first essay is called The Roots of Honor. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to lay out for you the arguments, the main arguments of The Roots of Honor. It should take maybe 20 minutes. Knowing me, 25. And then open it up for discussion. And then after we have some discussion, we can go on to the second essay and follow the same model if you'd like to do that. All right? So the first essay is called The Roots of Honor. The question Ruskin wants us to think about from the very beginning is that whom do we honor, and under what conditions do we honor them? What are the roots of honor? So that's the question that's essentially being asked. From the very first, as I'll try to show you in a moment, from the very first, he goes after the classical economists. He goes after Mill and Ricardo Bentham and Adam Smith. It's a direct attack on laissez-faire capitalism. Ruskin, many people miss this. Ruskin is not anti-capitalist. He's anti-selfish capitalism. He's anti-selfish anything. And what he wants, the idea behind laissez-faire as a phrase then becomes a metaphor. Essentially means to leave alone, to not get involved with, hands off, no interference, government or otherwise. Let the market take care of itself. This is the argument we hear all the time. I mean, you got to just pick up the papers tomorrow, and there it'll be again. Just you leave me alone. I have no other responsibilities. And so, and he comes around to this idea of Smith's, this idea that by everybody seeking, it's called another metaphor. It's called the invisible hand, and it says by everybody seeking their own interests, eventually the good of the commons will be served. I go after what I want, try to get as much money as I can. You go after you want. You try to get as much money as you can. And as you go along doing this, eventually people will get hired and everything will go along. As I'm saying this, it sounds like trickle-down economics to me. So what Ruskin would say is, tell it to the poor people. Tell it for the people who are never hired, waiting for the vineyard or anybody to come and hire them in the market as they wait during the day. Look around here. Look around Los Angeles. You have, I don't know how many poor people in Los Angeles, more than a few, I think, who are really in desperate straits. Nobody's ever hired them. Nobody's probably going to hire them. They don't have any skills anymore. They are lost. They're human beings. They have potential. They could have done things. They could have been educated. They could have done jobs. Yeah? But now we've let them go and we've lost them. Too bad, he says. I come from upstate New York, but I know New York City well because I've taught a course in it for 25 years. And the short of the story in New York City looks great. When you go to visit, right, it's terrific. Half of the people who live in New York City are at the poverty level or below it. Half, 50%. That's an astonishing abrogation of human responsibility, Ruskin would certainly argue. So he believes that this idea of hands-off, I have no responsibility to anybody but myself, is an abrogation of human responsibility in the doing of business. You are in it for yourself, you're in it for what you can get, and devil take the hindmost. If I've got to do whatever I have to do to get ahead of you, then I will do it. Too bad for you if you're not smart enough to figure it out and do your part. So he begins his essay. I'm going to read you the first paragraph. Where did I put that? Is it the first one?
Maybe the first two.
Yeah, here it is. So, if you have Clive's handout, well, it's Clive Wilmer's edition of Unto This Last that Gabriel brought for us, and you go to the first page of The Roots of Honor, and he begins his definition this way. He begins his essay this way. He says, among the delusions which at different periods have possessed themselves of the minds of large masses of the human race, perhaps the most curious, certainly the least creditable, is the soi-disant, self-defined, is the soi-disant science of political economy, based on the idea that an advantageous code of social action may be determined irrespectively of the influence of social affection. Listen, that term is critical. The influence of social affection. The second paragraph. Of course, this is quite funny, actually, if you spend a little time just kind of thinking of the examples it gives you. Of course, as in the instances of alchemy, astrology, witchcraft, and other such popular creeds, political economy has a plausible idea at the root of it. The social affections, says the economists, this would be the laissez-faire economists, are accidental and disturbing elements in human nature, but avarice and the desire for progress are constant elements. Let us eliminate the inconstants, that is the affections, and considering the human being merely as a covetous machine, examine by what laws of labor, purchase, and sale the greatest accumulative result in wealth is attainable. That is essentially the program of the classical economists. You go out and seek your own, do whatever you can to gather as much as you can for yourself. And that's the law. That's the law of business. Ruskin says, but wait a minute. I can understand that might be an interesting idea, but it doesn't really have to do with the complex human reality. The complex human reality is that human beings are not swines. Complex human reality is that human beings are not machines, that human beings are not simply things that calculate. Human beings are actually living, breathing, thinking, feeling things. And so this idea that you can do business without any appeal to the affections, the affective side of human beings, is a misrepresentation of how the world actually works. Because the affections, we could say the emotions, we could call them feelings, we could call them sentiments, are always there. They may be in play, they may not, but they're always there, and they play a role in every kind of trade that you do. They play a role actually in every single thing that we do. So then Ruskin says, I'm not talking about the affections as though they are good or bad in themselves. I'm just saying they're there. And you have to take account of them. So he introduces very quickly a wonderful example, which I think is one of the best things that he does in early part in the essay. He says, I want you to imagine, very common in the London of his day, almost everybody in his audience would have seen something like this. Maybe many of us have. I want you to imagine a mother with 3 children, and all they have between them in a given evening is 1 crust of bread. What's going to happen? Well, the classical economists would say that the strong will seek their own interest. And so the mother, being the stronger, will eat the bread, and the children will go hungry. Really, says Ruskin. Well, that is a possibility. But maybe she won't do that. Maybe she decides that she loves, there's an affection for you, her children enough that she'll take the piece of bread and divide it up between the 3 of them and go have nothing herself. Or maybe she'll say to herself, I'll give it to the oldest one, and then she will be stronger and she can go out and maybe find bread for the rest of us. Or maybe she'll say, I'll give it to the littlest one, because that one, we want that one to survive. The others might be able to survive. What is she going to do? And Ruskin says, we have no idea what she's going to do. The classical economists would say, she's the strongest. She will look out for herself first. She will eat the piece of bread, and too bad for the others. But Ruskin says that's not what happens. We don't know. This is a critical point. We don't know what she's going to do. You never know what someone else is really going to do. And the reason for that is because they're living sentient, affective beings. We are alive. Let me give you another example, more contemporary one. It's October, and you know winter is coming. We're talking about the affections now. And you need a sweater. So you say to yourself, okay, I'm going down to the store, and I'm going to go and buy myself a sweater. So you go into the store, and you go to the sweater section, and you say to the salesperson who comes to help you, I need a sweater for the winter. I want it to be warm. I want it to protect myself from the wind. I want it to be, I want it to be a really good sweater, and I really don't know anything about sweaters, so would you help me, please? So the seller says to himself, this woman doesn't know anything about sweaters. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to sell her an acrylic sweater. We have wool sweaters, but I'm going to sell her an acrylic sweater because we make $10 more. The store makes $10 more on the sale of the acrylic sweaters because the cost is lesser to buy them from the distributor than the wool sweaters. And that's what he does. Well, it's a month later, and the winds come on, and they're cold, and the woman puts on the sweater, and she's not warm, and she's not protected, and she begins to get a little upset. So she goes to her friends and says, why, I bought a sweater, I paid $75 for this sweater, and so what's going on? And they said, well, he tricked you, he duped you. He sold you a sweater that he made you think it was as good as any other sweater, but it's not as good as a wool sweater. What do you do now that you know this? Well, that's where the affections come in. You could decide to do nothing. You could, take it and lump it. You could decide to go back to the store and confront the salesperson and tell him that he was an immoral person and that you want your money back. You could go to the manager and ask that he get fired. You could just say, it's just human nature and watch out for the next time. What are you going to do? Ruskin says, we don't know what you're going to do because you're a human being and you make a real choice. But, he said, we do know this for a general principle, but not an absolute one. We know that if you treat somebody well in business or anything else, you are much more likely to get a positive response than a negative one. You could get a negative one. Who knows? That person may be having a bad day, whatever. But almost always that's what's going to happen. So imagine the other case. Imagine it's October and you need a sweater and you go into the shop and you get the salesperson, different salesperson. You go to the salesperson and say, I want to buy a sweater. I don't know anything about sweaters. I want it to be warm and be able to be strong enough to protect me from the wind when it comes blowing down from, I don't know, Santa Monica, something like that. Okay? So and that person knows that wool sweaters are better for this. Has them in stock. Knows that he also has acrylic sweaters in stock. And says, we won't make as much on the acrylic. I'm going to sell her the wool because that's what she needs. So another month passes. The winds come and so on. She's warm. She feels good about the sweater that she bought. She paid the same amount of money, $75. This is the vineyard owner's story in a different guise. Right? She feels good about what she does. She goes down to the store again, goes to the person selling it to her, tells him how much she appreciates him taking care of her. They begin to build a relationship. She goes back to him again. She tells her friends about him. They start going to her. She goes to the manager of the store and says, "You have such a wonderful young man working for you." Applause, applause, applause. Yes? Now look at what happens here. In the first case, you sow poison everywhere. You cheat somebody, you hoodwink them, you trick them. Do you think they miss it once they understand? Do you think they don't get it? Do you think that they're not angry about it? Affections. In the second case, you sow kindness and caring. And everybody's needs are met. The store makes $10 less. The store makes $10 more. The difference between the two is that in the second case, you've treated the other person like a human being and you've truly worked to meet their needs. Yeah? That's the law of business.
Where customers come the second time.
Where customers, they get their custom. That's what the word means. It means I'm willing to give you my custom. I will customarily come to you because you treat me well. It's a wonderful notion. This the classical economists leave out altogether. So you see what Ruskin's trying to do. He's trying to say that the gospel of making money that you folks are promulgating is pernicious. It's teaching people to act like machines and to take advantage of one another because you say the only purpose of business is to make money. You make products, of course, but the real purpose is to make money. Right? We hear these phrases all the time, don't we? The business of business is business. It's not, don't get me wrong, it's not personal, it's just business. Ruskin's argument is all business is personal. And the affections are always there and ready. Sometimes they come out, sometimes they don't, whatever. But this notion that we are just simply calculating creatures is utterly wrong. And so all these theorists are wrong. And we have been duped by them. This notion of laissez-faire, hands off, let me seek my own at your expense. Too bad, I sold you a bad sweater. You should have known better. Caveat emptor. Isn't that a great phrase? Ruskin hates the phrase. Let the buyer beware. Why shouldn't it be, let the buyer be secure? That I go to the store and I know that this person is out for my welfare. So, the affections. Now, he wants to tell us, he wants to hold up for us the reason why our notion of doing business is so radically wrong. Because we've been influenced by this theory so deeply. So he says, in all complex societies, it's all in the past. There have existed 5 great professions. There have always been soldiers. There's always been lawyers. There's always been doctors. There's always been teachers or priests or rabbis. And there's always been merchants. Those 5 professions exist everywhere. Ancient Rome, modern Greece, Sri Lanka. You can always find those. because those are central things that human beings have to do, take care of in their life. So why do we invent a doctor? And the answer is pretty simple. We invent a doctor because we can't do everything in our own individual life. I mean, I don't know what we do. I'm a sociologist. I'm not a doctor. I've got a car. I'm not a mechanic. I'm whatever, and I can't do all that stuff. So I can't do everything, so we invent someone to help us do it. So we invent a doctor whose job is to study his work, how to heal human beings, and then to take care of us and make us well. We go to the doctor to make us well. And we would be quite angry, would we not, if we thought the doctor dodged something or did an extra operation on us because he could make money on it as opposed to making us better. So we invent a doctor to heal us. And we invent a soldier, it's pretty simple, to defend us, to defend the nation. Yeah? And we invent a lawyer to make sure justice is done. And you all have heard all those lawyer jokes, and I don't know whether anybody is one in the room, but that's not my point. You've all heard the lawyer jokes. The lawyer jokes only exist because lawyers have transgressed their obligation to do justice above all for you, the client. They've charged you too much. They've gone in league with somebody behind your back. And you get mad at that. The affections. So soldiers and doctors and lawyers and ministers and priests and rabbis and teachers. Why do we invent them? I don't know anything about sociology. Come to me. I'm the guy who knows, right? I spent my life doing this. You would be quite upset with me, and rightly so, if I started, not showing up for class or telling you things that were so utterly simplistic and boring that you didn't have to come to class. My job is to make you excited about sociology, to make you interested in it, see why it's so important in life. Same with a minister or a rabbi. Right? Or a priest. You go to a priest to help you when you're ill and sick or whatever, and to help you when you're depressed. And you go, and if they didn't do this, you would be angry at them, would you not? The affections. Yes? And if they help you, you would be so pleased and so thankful, would you not? The affections. Yeah? So all those great professions, soldiers, lawyers, doctors, teachers, all exist to help us. There's one great profession left. The merchant, the trader, the business person. Well, if all the others we invent to help us, on what logical grounds can we say that the merchant doesn't exist to help us too? And Ruskin would say there are no logical grounds to say that the merchant. So he wants us to see the twist in our conception. We say merchants, they're an exception somehow. They're out to get as much as they possibly can out of somebody. Ruskin says no. Their job is to give you what you need. Is to produce what you need, to give you what you need, to make you stronger. Of course they have to make money. But money's not the reason they exist. The priest doesn't exist to make money. Right? The soldier doesn't exist to make money. The lawyer doesn't exist to make money, but to see that justice is done. So here's one of the great passages. We're almost done with this chapter. Or what I think is almost done with this chapter. This is okay. Here's where it is. In your copy, it's page 178, and it's the top. And it's one of the best bits of Ruskin ever when he's in his sociological mode. But he wasn't too bad when he was describing the flowers on the Jura Mountain. At the top of 178, here's what he writes. This is the merchant's function. Remember what his job is? Okay, I missed this, so I'll stop and say it. The Roots of Honor is the title of the essay. The roots of honor are service When someone serves us as they are expected to serve us, we honor them. When they do not, we dishonor them. We honor Lincoln because he gave of his life at great personal cost to save the nation. We dishonor Nixon because he lied in his own self-interest. He tried to trick us. He abrogated the responsibility of President of the United States. Yes? All you have to do, I don't know Los Angeles very well, but all you have to do is go around and see who you've put up monuments to. And if later on we find out that they did something bad or something like that, that's not the point. We put up the monuments to them because they saved us in wartime, because they were a signal justice on the Supreme Court, because they Jenny Lind, they saved people in wartime. They took their task and they performed it to the greatest degree without any thought of themselves, even to the point of no money, at great cost to themselves. Those are the roots of honor. The affections. Honoring someone is an affection. So now the merchant. What is the merchant's obligation? And here it is at the top of 178. Observe. The merchants or manufacturers, for in the broad sense in which it is used here, the word must be understood to include both, is to provide for the nation. It is no more his function to get profit for himself out of that provision than it is a clergyman's function to get his stipend. That stipend is a due and necessary adjunct, but not the object of his life, if he be a true clergyman, any more than his fee or honorarium is the object of life to a true physician. Neither is his fee the object of life to a true merchant. All three, if true men, he means performing their role in the world why we invented them in the first place. All three, if true men, have a work to be done irrespective of fee, to be done even at any cost, or for quite the contrary of fee. The pastor's function being to teach, the physician's to heal, and the merchants, as I have said, to provide. That is to say, this is one of the really wonderful passages of Ruskin. That is to say, he, the merchant, has to understand to their very root the qualities of the things he deals in, and the means of obtaining and producing it. That's the thing he produces. And he has to apply all his sagacity and energy to the producing or obtaining it in perfect state, and distributing it at the cheapest possible price where it is most needed. Let me comment on a couple of those phrases that he mentions here. He has to understand to its very root the qualities of the things that he produces. What makes the best milk for consumption? What makes the best sweater to protect against cold and wind? What makes whatever? What will help my students, again taking my own example, understand the great principles of sociology? That's what I have to do. That's my job, to understand that and to give that to you, because that's why you give me your money. Yes? You come here to get what I have to give that you don't have, which if I give you will make you stronger. Understand it to the very root. The thing he deals with, the means of obtaining and producing it. How do I get it? How do I make sure I have all the knowledge that I need? Do I go to a conference? Do I study as an apprentice with somebody else? How do I get to be the best at what I do? This is no lackadaisical fly-by-night kind of thing, friends. You can't fool around if you're really taking your work seriously. This is an obligation of you to another human being. Yeah? All right, the third phrase in there, has to apply all his sagacity and energy to producing it or the obtaining it in perfect state. I'm selling you milk that I know is good milk, that has been produced properly, that has no preservatives, that has whatever, and I'm making sure that you get the best possible product. I'm not selling you a cheap sweater. I'm not selling you a wool sweater that's hidden, half acrylic. I'm selling you a real wool sweater here. Yeah? And distributing it at the cheapest possible price where it is most needed. When I talk to a lot of business people that I know, they don't like this cheapest possible price business. But here's what he means. The cheapest possible price is the fair price that I have to charge you for collecting it, producing it, packaging it, distributing it, paying the workers who worked for me, keeping the lights on, putting whatever amount necessary for a rainy day in case there's a bad market year, and some research and development, and a little bit left over for what I need to live. Not opulently, just decently. Yeah, that's my price. Ruskin you won't be surprised, was an enormous advocate of what he called open books. He said, you should be able to walk into any business and ask to see why you're charging $75 for a sweater. And they'll take you upstairs and they'll show you so much for this, so much for this, so much for this. What's to hide if you're honest? Yep. So, that's...
A lot of restaurants now are saying we add a small percentage for our workers' health.
Yes. And that's certainly, Ruskin would say that'd be certainly legitimate. We know what it is. We know why you're doing it. We applaud you for the doing it. And we want you to have healthy workers. That's fine. Okay, so let's go on to the next paragraph, and then we'll end up with this essay and talk a little bit. And because the production or obtaining of any commodity involves necessarily the agency in many lives and hands, the merchant becomes in the course of his business the master and governor of large masses of men in a more direct though less confessed way than a military officer or pastor, so that on him falls in great part the responsibility for the kind of life they lead. And it becomes his duty not only to be always considering how to produce what he sells in the purest and cheapest forms, but how to make the various employments involved in the production or transference of it most beneficial to the men employed. In other words, the merchant hires people and is utterly responsible for the quality of their life. The vineyard worker, the vineyard owner, I am responsible for you as a human being because I've hired you. It is immoral of me to pay you less than you need for a day's labor. It is immoral of me to not provide for your health care if that is my responsibility. Anything like that is cheating, cousining, sowing poison into the social fabric. Anything where you don't do that is sowing human benefit. So the last page of this essay, we are on 179 now. And I'm just about done with this. The roots of honor. Supposing the captain of a frigate, where am I? First paragraph. Supposing the captain of a frigate saw it right, or were by any chance obliged to place his own son, the affections, to place his own son in the position of a common sailor, as he would then treat his son, he is bound always to treat every one of the men under him. And so also supposing the master of a manufactory saw it right, or were by any chance obliged to place his own son in the position of an ordinary workman, he would then treat his son as he is always bound to treat every one of his men. That's a wonderful little passage. I want the best for my kids. They're my kids. I want to make sure that they're well. I want to make sure that they're healthy. I want to make sure that they're capable of being functioning adults in the world. And I'm going to devote my energy to do that. So too, you treat your workers in exactly the same way. And so down a little bit further near the very bottom, last paragraph, I'll just read a little bit where he says, he's now reflecting back on the whole essay, which he knows is radically different from what everyone is doing out there. He says, all of which sounds very strange. The only real strangeness in the matter being, nevertheless, that it should so sound. For all this is true, and that not practically nor theoretically, but everlastingly and practically, I said partially before. All other doctrine than this respecting matters political or economic, we could say, being false in premise, absurd in deduction, and impossible in practice with any progressive state of national life. That's pretty much, well, at least it's the good surface of the essay. 9 pages. Okay, so that's the roots of honor. So, want to talk? You can see why they were so angry with him, the affections. Because he went against every principle that most of these people in business practiced. They believed in a dog-eat-dog world. Human beings are vicious creatures who will do anything to advantage themselves, will do anything to disadvantage others with whom they are in eternal competition. It's the old, I don't know whether this is part of your own background of studies, the old Hobbesian state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish, and short. That's the principle of laissez-faire. And they hated him for calling them out on this and telling them that human beings were not covetous machines, that our real obligation is to take care of each other, and that merchants are not exceptions to the rule. They are part of the whole process of a decent social order.
A couple of things have always struck me about, all of Ruskin's social thought, is it's always rooted in anthropology. I mean, everything is rooted in what you think a human being is. So he always goes back to these first principles of what is a human being, and then we argue out from that how we proceed. So for Ruskin, the notion, the Adam Smith Mill school, that man is basically a covetous machine, driven basically by greed, is not simply morally problematic, but it's a completely false and inadequate understanding of the human person. So one of the things I always admire with Ruskin is that going back to the fundamental principle and beginning to argue out from it. Another thing which I think so strong in Ruskin is this, of course, is a notion that later on was developed by certain approaches to Darwin, for example, social Darwinism, the whole notion of the survival of the fittest, is Ruskin's contrary notion, which comes in a number of his later works, of the law of help. That on the contrary, that we're built to be cooperative beings, fundamentally looking after each other, that this is a law built into the way that we really operate. And so this false economy and this false economy is again basically false to our nature, and that when we think about economic life, we need to return to these first principles, to these first questions that Ruskin always wants us to get back to.
I wonder what Ruskin would think of hedge fund managers, bankers, speculators, real estate, and all these derivative markets, and even mutual funds that we have as our retirements.
Yeah.
Because other mutual funds are invested in these huge big banks that are killing our economy.
Yeah.
And when I call TRCLEF for colleges to find out if I can pull my money out of the Goldman Sachs and whatever they are, Chase, whatever the funds are, they said, absolutely not. I cannot. There's no way I cannot not keep my retirement money with these bankers and these thieves. There's no way around it. Unless they dissolve. It's the university who made these decisions. It's the TRCLEF who made the decisions. It's humongous mutual funds that provide for our retirement, right? These are the money that are given to Bank of America to rob us with.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, he would have a lot of trouble with a lot of those funds.
Yes.
Yeah.
Many years ago, I got into a discussion with my principal the head of the firm, he was saying it was his obligation to support our families. And he was really feeling bad he had to cut us back to 4 days a week. And I told him, no, your obligation is to keep this firm running so that we can support our families. And if we can't do it
That's
on
right.
your 4 days
That's
a
true.
week, we'll go out and find a 5th day somewhere else. So cut us back to 4 days a week and keep the firm going.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, Ruskin speaks to that
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
first essay.
Yeah.
And he says there are certain situations where compromises have to be made for the good of all. And the example you give is perfect. I can't run this business unless I cut you back to four a day. I'll do my best to help you find another way for your 5th day, and something like that. Otherwise, it's gone and you've got no days of work, and I don't have a business anymore. Yeah, so that's a good example.
I teach my students that the purpose of any business is to meet a market need and a profit. If you ignore either one of those things, you won't be in business very long.
Some of that's in the second essay. we get to that if we get to that. So any other? Whoops, sorry. So giving me trouble. Any other comments about this? Anything else you'd like to talk about?
Just a comment that for me, and I'm sure for May also, because we're merchants.
Mm-hmm.
We have a small business, a retail business.
Yes, right.
So we deal with customers, with employees.
Right.
So this really, it feels like it was written today.
Yes, it does do
And
that.
so there's lots of questions.
Yeah.
We try to run our business with
Yeah.
good principles, with
Right.
taking care of the person,
Right.
but what he's talking about is really principles that
Yeah.
can be applied, that we can take, and not just, they're not beautiful words.
Yeah.
And he would be proud that we can take these words and
Yeah.
apply them.
Thank you for saying that. He made a conscious effort to not describe the flowers in writing this. He said, "I'm not going to use beautiful words anymore. I really have to tell the truth the way it is. Because if I use all those wonderful words, even though I believe they're true in another context," he says that they won't take the lesson. Yeah. So, but thank you for that, because that makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, I live in a small town in Geneva, New York, upstate New York, and I know most of the merchants, and they know me. And as soon as I know that they're treating me well, I trust them. I give them an extra tip at Christmas without thinking about it. I recommend them to others. Gabriel and I share the same travel agent.
No.
Okay? And I've never seen her. She works in Albany. And she and her husband run a travel business. And for 25 years, she's been my travel agent. And I go back to her because she is always there. I know exactly how much money she's making on any given transaction. She's very clear about that. I know if I call her at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'm in Hong Kong, which I have been, and say my flight's canceled, she will pick up the phone and get me on another flight immediately and won't charge me a cent for it. And she gets my custom because she treats me like a person. And I've never seen her, but she acts in a Ruskinian sense here. So that's what you're talking about. It creates goodwill everywhere. You don't have to try to create goodwill. All you have to do is treat people decently. It's pretty simple, really. But they hated him for saying it. Here's another way to think about it. Like with kids, this notion of caveat emptor. So, you raise your kids I presume most of us have had them. You raise your kids at an enormous personal cost. You got to stay up late. You got to change diapers when you don't have to. You got to feed them. You got to do this, spend money, and so on and so on. And why do you do it? You do it because you love them, because of the affections, right? And you do it also because they are in great need of what you have to give, which if you don't give it, they don't grow strong. In other words, you have to teach them how to tie their shoes. You have to teach them how to speak. You have to teach them not to put their hand on the stove. You have to, tens of thousands of things. They need that that teaching. You owe it to them as human beings of your body, who came out of your body. You owe it to them, and you love them. And guess what? If you do that, things will work out pretty well. And then you say to them at the end, this is the irony, and then you say, and now go out into this dog-eat-dog world and try to get as much as you can out of everybody else, no matter what the consequences are. You see the ambiguity of the whole thing. It's just really stunning. human beings need each other from the first to the end. Yeah. Okay, so here's a real question, a really powerful question. It's 9:00. There's another one. You want to do it, or you want to save it for another night? We can do another night. I can come back. I intend to come back. I'm like the bad penny. I keep turning up. So it's up to you. I can go on till 3 a.m. with Ruskin, but I don't know whether where your attention is. It's perfectly fine. This has really been a good first effort at this. But I'm willing to go on with the second one if you want. On the other hand, if we do it again, we can make sure they all do their homework.
Maria, what do you think? Do you want to go a little longer? Or?
There are several more questions about what you said.
Oh, well, then let's do that.
That's a third way.
No, let's do that. Let's do the questions that have been raised by this discussion.
Where to begin? I'll begin with something abstract. If Ruskin's great enemy was laissez-faire capitalism,
Yeah.
were he to live in our time,
Yeah.
I think that the great opponent would be what's called the pure procedural view of justice. And instead of talking about Mill, I think he'd talk about John Rawls. And what John Rawls in fact says is, people don't agree about ultimate goods. They don't even agree about intermediate goods a lot of the time. And they certainly don't share one view of the human person.
All true.
So what we need, and Rawls would say, I think they're A, B, C, and Z to support it, is not a rich and thick theory of the good, which I think you have as soon as you have somebody talking about crafts, say, and vocation, say, whereas Ruskinian themes. That all involves a rich, thick theory of the good. But there are a lot of people who, they just as soon have the acrylics so they could spend the rest of their money on some other shoddy something or other.
Yeah.
So, what we need is a minimal theory of the good and a legal system that will prevent anybody from imposing his or her particular thick theory of the good. And we could go back and forth here. If a whole lot of people in the governing elite in England at Ruskin's time had accepted Ruskin's views, the state would have taken on a presence that today a great many people would say is wholly paternalistic. And if you want that sort of thing, join a club. And maybe I'll join it too, but a whole lot of people don't want that sort of thing. After all, Ruskin had a whole lot of critics. And were he to say what he says today, he would still have a whole lot of critics.
He does.
And it's wonderful that there's the Ruskin Club. And we ought to preserve enough liberty in the public space for there to be a Ruskin Club. That's for sure. We need a kind of detached, procedural kind of liberal polity. And that's what you're going to get, unless you can get everybody, a great majority of people to agree with you. Watch out, because if you have a state that tries to inculcate virtues, whoa. Whereas classically, Aristotle and Plato would say that one of the main functions of the state is to teach the virtues.
That's right.
But if in fact we disagree about what the virtues are, well, we're going to have a pure procedural approach to justice. Justice is what you get at the end of these various processes which are legally agreed upon. That's all justice really is.
Well, that's a definition of justice.
No,
Plato has his own definition of justice.
So do other thinkers. However, just as pervasive as laissez-faire economics were in, say, the time of what Leo XIII referred to as Manchester liberalism. Equally pervasive today is a fundamental liberal view that sees justice as the result of a system, a set of procedures. And are you going to challenge that? Well, then you must have a thick theory of the good. I'm sorry, we really can't agree about what the good is.
Well, then you're lost. Finally,
Yes, we are.
then you're lost. Ruskin, actually, there's another lecture which I can at least give you the reference of, of 1869, called "The Mystery of Life and Its Arts," and in it I think he's grappling with the issue that you raise. He says, "What is the good?" And he says, "What is sure good? How can we be assured that we're doing something truly good in the world?" And then he has a number of things that he talks about. And here are the things that he talks about, thick theory or not. He says, sure good resides in feeding people. People everywhere have to be fed adequately, nutritionally, etc. That's sure good. Can't go wrong doing that. You don't overfeed them, you don't underfeed them. You feed them with high quality food to make them strong. People need to be clothed everywhere. They need, it doesn't matter, some places less clothes, some places more, and so on, and they have to have good quality clothes. People have to be sheltered everywhere, and they have to have those things in life. That's sure good. You don't have to go any further, you don't have to go any deeper, you don't have to debate it much more. Give people clothing, food, and shelter, and then they have to be educated, and then we get into your complex issues, right? And he says, but now what do we mean by education? He would say that we mean by education to teach people those things that they need to know in order to take care of their fellow human beings first and foremost. To make them strong. If we ever get to the fourth lecture, we're not going to do that tonight, but if we ever get to the fourth lecture, he says, there is no wealth but life. And what he means by that is that your obligation as a human being is to make yourself as strong as you possibly can with the help of all these others, so then in your strength you can help all of these others. Human strength, well-being, mentally and physically, all those are sure goods. All of those are sure
and
goods.
aren't you talking about, in virtues, aren't you talking about compassion?
Yeah.
Which inevitably, when Robert Pinsky was here, he talked about culture. And the reason he talked about culture, he said my inheritance, and he was saying my inheritance is not my family, my inheritance is my culture. And then he started to list the things that in his life have influenced him as a human being. And because the culture inevitably teaches us how to be human and reminds us of our humanity, and that in and of itself is virtue. I love Emily Dickinson's quote. She said, "Genius is the ignition of affection, not intellect." The ignition being sort of one of the key words there, sort of, at the start, because in order to, and I've always believed this, in order to, you can have all kinds of rote learning, and you can have all kinds of equations for what's going to be set up as a successful society, maybe financially, but what really makes a society successful is inevitably the ability to see others, to see beyond your front door, and then that goes beyond seeing beyond your neighborhood, beyond your country, and it goes on and on and on, and the intelligence has to have an element of compassion involved with it for us to be
That's
able
the
to.
affection, sure.
Yeah, and I think that, I believe that that's a lot of what Ruskin is about. So, we teach our children kindness first, and then there are all those other elements that come in after that. I don't know. Goodness. I was a preschool teacher for about 20 years, and I found that if children learned how to respond to each other, and learned how to, you actually had to teach very young children empathy and compassion. It didn't come quite naturally in the beginning, and that was so key. And I realized that that was going to be something that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And that was the major building block. Once they had that, all the other stuff was, for me, that was foundational.
I think it would be for him as well. I mean, Ruskin was adopted. One of his, he wasn't really his student, but he was there at the same time. At the same time that Ruskin was at Oxford, William Morris was at Oxford. And William Morris loved Ruskin, avidly devoured his books. And as he moved on in life, Morris became a socialist and based a lot of his socialism on Ruskin's thinking. And then later on, still in his life, became a real communist. And so one of the mistakes that's made in thinking about Ruskin is when people hear things like this, particularly in America, not so much in Britain. There's culture for you. They think that Ruskin's really a socialist. And under this last in at least 3 places, he says, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a communist. Those systems won't work. You can never take away from human beings their own individual motivation to take care of to make their own lives better. You can't assign them to something. You can't pay them all the same. That's in the second essay, really. You just can't interfere like that. So your question about state interference, Ruskin was absolutely the opposite of this. He would say that you don't want the state at all. What you want are local people taking care of each other because they know that's the way that they'll live the best. If you have to have a state, then you have it. And if the state has to intervene, I live in New York State, and the state has to intervene to get enough money to pay for people's health care and education. And it's reprehensible. Not because they're doing it, I'm glad they're doing it, but because they have to do it, because somewhere somebody's not paying enough money to make sure it happens on the local level, so they got to do it on the broader level, which makes all of these complications about having the state involved in your life. Yeah. It's between us, here we are, we're 20 people. Okay, so it's between us how to figure out how to do this. The British have this state health. Forget what the issues are about how effective it is and all of that. But they did it because they couldn't get health for everybody. Ruskin would hate it, and he would vote for it. Although he never voted. But he would vote for it because you got to take, sick human beings don't help anybody. So you make sure that they don't get sick, or you take care of them when they are. And that's the only way you can do it. That's a bigger obligation than not doing it.
Now,
Good.
how about companies who sees this and who see that their employees should be healthy, but not because they love them, it's because they want more profit. Because that's true that there is the social affection and even emotional intelligence, for the children, they need to learn empathy. But this is now emotional intelligence is like how to do business. It's not so much because those business people they want to love their employees or they care about their employees. It's not this, but they do exactly the same as if there is the social.
Ruskin would be okay with that. He would say that's not quite where the vineyard owner is, but we're okay with that. Because they are going to do the things to make their workers strong. And he certainly would be okay with that.
But the employees are not happy.
You mean if they're taken care of, they're not happy?
No, they are. They have their health, they're eating well, I'm talking about Apple and Google. But if you talk with employees like this, they say that they take advantage of us. They're taking, they're giving them a lot, And this is what, when we go to conferences, all this, we are taught, to do the good business, and, it's like you're loving them in a Christian love. And, you have all these things, but there's a difference between loving them for themselves and loving them to make more profit.
Yeah.
This is
there's
what
a
I'm
passage
saying.
of it.
Even though they're giving them a lot, they're paid well, but how much they work, they really overwork. And, it's like by meeting people like this, the employees of
That's what
this
Tesla's
business,
employers say too. They're if they feel overworked. But it's interesting.
But that would be a principle of running a business, that you don't overwork them, because then you'll tire them out and then they'll be resentful. Why would you overwork them? You have, I don't know whether 40 hours a week is it. I have no idea. We could argue about that. But you don't overwork them.
Well, there's an interesting passage in the essay earlier, page 171. I'll just read the end of the paragraph. Treat the servant kindly with the idea of turning his gratitude to account, and you will get as you deserve no gratitude, nor any value for your kindness. But treat him kindly without any economical purpose, and all economical purposes will be answered. In this, as in all matters, whoever will save his life shall lose it, whoever loses it shall find it. So he talks about this whole idea of the worker sensing that the goodness being shown to them is entirely motivated by the desire for profit, and it won't work.
Yeah, that's what I would mention. That remembers me another topic that is what we start talking now in economics on the relational goods.
Yeah.
Meaning, we should give a certain value to the relationship between persons.
Right.
Is a tremendous factor of economics.
Yeah.
So it must be reciprocal.
Yeah.
So that's, economics has been evolving.
Yeah.
In Europe, I come from Europe, from Italy, and it's true that in Europe we have more a socialist government sort of style. Here we are more a capitalist. But you can see that there is a trend in both directions now. America is trying to emulate some aspects of the European system. The European system is trying to emulate the American system. And I think there is a progress in economics. We saw the fall of communism concept. We are seeing also the failure of capitalism. We are seeing it with the relatively recent economic downturn, which was really
It was a massive
disaster.
Could happen again.
I was a manager of a company in Italy. We have to shut it down because it was impossible to manage. And luckily we managed. We have a system there to cope for the workers. Eventually, too much we can say as compared to what we have here, but the system actually covered them for many years, and they eventually overcome the financial crisis. So I think there is an evolution. We are taking lessons. Humanity is learning lessons. It's interesting to see that Ruskin in the 1800s had such a vision, which is essentially a deep human vision. And that's another topic that I think it's somehow hidden is the trust. I would define in business is essential, which again is a relational bond.
Yeah, it's an affectional.
Yeah, exactly. If you are, it takes a lot of time to gain that trust, and you can lose it in an instant.
Yeah.
So that's again a relationship. So perhaps that's the positive is that humanity is learning in the process.
Well, I think we are. It's slow. It's slow.
It took 400 years to find out that Adam Schmidt, in his concepts of multiplying the machine, we took Ishii Ono in Japan 400 years later to come with just in time, which is basically a completely 380 degrees around of looking at things. That was, the assessment was not right in the machine. But we went on for 400 years assuming this was the best way to do mass scale production, and now it's understood it's not the best way.
It's not the best
Yeah.
way. I'm just thinking about a couple of comments, your comment as well, that, when the workers take advantage of you. We live in, it's really a pernicious system. I mean, we have been taught this since we were so tiny that everybody's out for themselves. And it's not just in business, it's this view of human nature as being exploitive and cruel. And, what was Tennyson's phrase? Red in fang and claw. Ruskin thought all of that was wrong. I mean, it just was a misinterpretation. That's really what this is about. That this is a misinterpretation, that human beings really aren't like this. They're like something else, which is what he tries to do in the first essay. And so to get, I think we're always subject to that, okay, somebody's good to me, I can take advantage of them or something like that. But that's the poison of the system that's already in there. So his answer to this, and then I'm sorry, I'll come right away. But his answer to this is, what can you do? You can do what you can do. That's all you can do. You can do what you can do, knowing what is the right thing to do. You can do that. You can't do more than that. I can't change you. You can't change me. I can do what I believe is the right thing to do. That's what I can do. Last point before he says Ruskin inherited from his father, when his father died in 1864, probably something on the order of $30 million in today's dollars. He had given it all away 6 years later to people who needed it. He gave it away to, he bought great art. He bought Turner's, and he bought a Titian, and he bought these other ones. He kept them for a while. He gave them all to the nation. They all went to public institutions. He said, I'm only the caretaker of the art. I have to make sure that the nation has the art. That was the really only indulgence. He bought a wonderful house in the North Country in the Lake District of England. He did almost nothing to fix it up. He had plenty of money. He could have made it into a mansion. He just lived in it. He had his parents' furniture until he died when he was 90 years old. People, said, well, why don't you get some better furniture? And he said, it's good enough for my parents. It's good enough for me. And he just, he thought, I don't need it. This is what I can do. I give away what I don't to others who need it more. He helped churches. He bought houses in London for the poor and hired somebody to manage them. He supported, by the way, here's something else often said against Ruskin, that he was anti-feminist. He wasn't an anti-feminist. Some of his deepest friends were wonderful, intelligent women, but mostly he went out and supported women who wanted to become artists and work in the world. He paid for them all. Anyway, I didn't want to get off on that so much, but the short answer is, you can do what you can do. You can't do more than that, but you can do what you can do, and you make a difference by doing what you do.
I had a question about Ruskin's definition of a human being, because in a book I noticed that he defines humans as souls, with the capital.
Yes.
So the concept of a soul actually points to the spiritual rather than affection or affect or
you're right.
motivation and all the good we do. So the service to others is a service to another soul. So we acknowledge the divinity and the mortality of the soul in there, which is really underneath all these economics and whatnot, that we all want souls connected, and therefore we should act out this connection in physical world.
Yeah, that's nice, and that's true. Ruskin was raised a strict evangelical. Every word in the Bible was true and all of that. His mother raised him and made him into the best biblical scholar of the 19th century. I mean, Ruskin knew his Bible backward and forward. He could talk about chapter and verse. If you read your Ruskin with any intensity, you've got to have King James Version of the Bible next to you to figure out what he's talking about half the time. Anyway, gave that up because that was the time of evolutionary theory and Darwin, and he gave it all up, but never gave up this notion that a benevolent spirit had created all these wonderful things for us. And the key thing in that benevolent spirit's mind, whether we agree with this or not, this is what he thought. The key thing in that benevolent spirit's mind was that life would be joyous, and that everywhere you would go, you would see all these the flowers in the Jura Mountain. You would see God has given us the earth for our life. It is a great entail. So he always had that. He never went back to formal religion, but he always had that.
Thank you for your answer.
Yay.
Oh, of course.
No, because like seeing this, like he was against so many,
Yeah.
and he was so. It's the same like
Yeah.
today. I mean, it's like a small,
Yeah.
very small group of people who are against so many. So what
Yeah.
you said, it's like whatever good they can do, it's
Right.
still good. You know,
Right.
it's like.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like sometimes we think, oh, everyone should be like this, but
Yeah.
it's not.
My students often use that excuse. Oh, well, it'll be okay when everybody decides to do it.
Yeah, but it's
And of
not
course,
like-
that's just a cop-out, as we used to say, right?
Right.
It's just an excuse saying, I don't really want to do it right now.
Yeah.
But you think of the point that you made. Ruskin made choices, personal choices, and we're still living off the capital of those choices. We're still reading him, still being inspired by him from one human being's choices. You know, one human being's openness. You know, it's still feeding us. So I think he would certainly underline the power of the individual choice.
There are passages where he says, you know, some of us by the chance of life may be in positions where we can make more difference, but everybody makes a difference. Everybody counts. Every human being is a human being to be taken care of and cherished and helped. And he's always very, very clear about that. And he says, my great gift was to have been born into this family and have had all these benefits. I have now an obligation as the recipient of all that goodness to do something good for others. And he lived his whole life with that in mind. He was the vineyard owner. I do think that we're
We're coming back.
Yeah, well, no, I'm feeling it's been 2 hours. I think people are tired.
I just came back from a kind of a trip to Ruskin country. I flew back from the UK on Sunday and spent 3 days at Ruskin's estate in Brentwood and so forth. And one of the most moving stories I heard that I think really reflects some of really who Ruskin was. In Sheffield, which is a working class town, the Ruskin name is still very much alive because he went there and felt that factory workers who were living, in the middle of the 19th century, miserable lives, that while it might be difficult to go against, he was going against the system, of course, in his writings, but that he needed to do something deeper for them. So what he did was he set up a museum for working people. He put it in a village just outside Sheffield, so the workers would have to come out of the smog of industrial Sheffield, come up to this village where there was decent air. And the museum was cared for by a marvelous couple, the Swans, who were to keep it open till late at night, so these workers after work could come with their families. And the museum would be loaded with treasures of beautiful old books and blueprints, so that these bricklayers could learn something about architecture. Geological specimens, paintings and drawings, so they would come to understand what beauty was. And it had an enormous, still to this day, it's having an enormous effect on the people of Sheffield. It still exists. This collection, the Ruskin Gallery in Sheffield. It's in a mall currently. People just come in, flock in to see this collection, which remains for the people of Sheffield. One of the stories I heard there was a young knife grinder, Benjamin Kressick, one of these workers. Knife grinding in Sheffield was a very cruel work because knife grinders were grinding into these wheels, these stone wheels that were moistened with water, and so as they're grinding, through the water, they're inhaling metal fragments. So the normal thing was, they said the knife grinder never lasts beyond the age of 30 because of serious pulmonary disease. So one of these knife grinders at age 23 or 24 went to the museum, showed some drawings he had made. They were given to Ruskin. Ruskin immediately saw real talent. And so he pulled this young man off the knife grinding routine, eventually taught him drawing, subsidized his education as a sculptor, sent him to Birmingham, where he became kind of the leading civic sculptor of Birmingham well into the 20th century. But that act of saving people literally from these situations and then financing them into a way in which they could realize what they had was, and there are thousands of these stories.
Well, the reason he chose Sheffield in addition is that that's where the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution were the worst.
Were the worst.
Where the worst pollution was, where the water was the worst, where you had the workers dying, and he said, we'll start there. And the other thing to say about that, Gabriel's example, is that he didn't have to do that. But he did have to do that. And that's what he could do. So it's a very wonderful place to go to still.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
What's fascinating, you think of like, okay, you open a museum in a working class town, big deal. But it's still having this effect. I saw, a young guy. I was watching some of the people who were just drifting into the gallery, looking at the various exhibits, and one young Sheffield guy turns to his mom and he says, "Yeah, he gave all this to us."
It's neat.
Taking possession of this, even 150 years later. So again, I think it's that, without being sentimental about it, I think it's to understand the power of choice. People, we can choose, and that goodness has this enormous effect beyond what we can ever even begin to imagine.
There is one place where he says, I'm trying to think whether it's in under this last. Yes, it is. It's in a later essay. He says, you can never know what the effects of what you do are going to be. You can never know. You can hope, you can wish, you can push things in certain directions. But the one thing you can know is whether you're acting justly and you're trying to help other human beings as you go on. You can know that. You might even make mistakes at that, but then you'll correct them. But that's the one thing you can know, that this is the right thing to do. And that's what the vineyard owner says at the very end.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I do it finally because it's right to do. Well, thanks all.
Thank you.
I'm more than happy to do more, but I kind of feel I'm on 3 hours jet lag, you're on 8.
Yes.
Anyway, it's been great. If you want to do it again, we can. I will reiterate, if you are at all interested, I do have a regular blog site on Ruskin called Why Ruskin, and you're more than welcome to have a look at it. And I put up Ruskin quotes and tell Ruskin stories and things like that. I've had good response to it, so that's available. And if you're at all interested, no cost, I've written an essay called Why Ruskin, and it basically outlines why we have to today revive and think about Ruskin. If you're interested in that, glad to talk to you about it.
Lovely. Thank you.
Also, the My Ruskin blog is on the Ruskin Art Club website. So
That's right. You can find it there.
You can
too.
also link up with it there. One thing, this is just an announcement about an upcoming activity. The Ruskin Art Club has its major event each year is the Ruskin Lecture, which is always at USC at the Doheny Library. That will be September 5th. This year at 5:30, I think. There will be an exhibition of Ruskin Art Club historical archive material, and the Feuchtwanger room, and then the lecture, I think, is at 6. Will be delivered this year by William Deverell, Professor William Deverell, a famous, well-known California historian. Because this is our 130th year, we're taking a little focus on the history of Los Angeles. So Bill will be giving he's an amazing lecturer. He'll be giving a talk called Brash, Los Angeles in 1888. So it should be great. Should be great fun. Again, all the information will be on the website ruskinartclub.com. So please check out that. We also have lots of resources on that site, complete works of Ruskin. We have, lectures and events of the recent past. So please avail yourself of that. And thank you again, Maria.
Thanks for having us.
Hospitality,
Yes, thank you.
and for all of you coming. Lovely. Thank you.